All right, continuing on in chapter 2. So we talked about our general chemistry ideas, talked about bonding and things like this in general, but now we're going to focus in on water in chapter 2.2. It's because water is really important for life. You're probably aware of that, but we're going to go into some of the reasons why and some of the unique properties about water that make it so critical for life. One of those is we're going to talk a lot about it being a solvent. That means it is a liquid that can dissolve other things into it. We're going to talk about some of its properties like cohesion and adhesion, surface tension, stuff like that. And then we are going to touch briefly on pH, acids, bases, and these things called buffer and how they maintain our body at homeostasis, where we're in a specific range and we do not deviate from that. So water is often called the solvent of life. It's critical. It is about 60 to 70% of your body, and all life as we know it requires water. We don't have any life that can exist without water that we know of. That is mainly because of that ability to be a solvent. So let's talk about what a solvent is. Okay, in the last section, we talked about our covalent bonds and how sometimes they are what's called polar, where we have a slight negative charge on one part and a slight positive on the other part. This is going to interact with other things. We said water could interact with itself, causing those hydrogen bonds, but we're going to talk about solubility now. And solubility, we have a couple parts to it. We'll talk about all the different pieces, but let's talk about water as a solvent. So water is polar, and it will dissolve ionic compounds or other polar compounds. So something like sodium chloride, our table salt. This is a substance that is hydrophilic. So that is hydro is water, philic is loving, so water loving. Okay, so how does it actually do that? Well, here's our sodium chloride. When we immerse it in water, the water molecules with their slight negative and slight positive will actually surround the ions that are in here. So here's a positive sodium ion. It gets surrounded by these negative partial negative charges from the oxygen in water, and the chloride with its negative charge gets surrounded by the slightly positive hydrogens in water, and that is a process that we call dissolving. Okay, so let's go over some terminology here. We have what we call the solvent, that is the thing that does the dissolving, and then the substance that is dissolved in it is the solute. We'll talk about this more later in the course, but you can actually calculate this. We have something called concentration. That is how much of the dissolved stuff is in a unit of it. So we could have like grams per liter or something like that. And that concentration can be important. Okay, so let's talk about water's polarity and what happens when you don't have a polar substance that is interacting with water. So we said polar substances would dissolve things that are non-polar, like oily hydrocarbons. We'll talk about what a hydrocarbon is in the next few sections when we talk about our macromolecules, but they are non-polar molecules. They are long chains with lots of hydrogen and carbon, and they are nonpolar, and they do not dissolve in water. So you've probably mixed oil and water together and noted that they do not dissolve. That's because the non-polar substance, the oils in there, are hydrophobic, water-fearing. They do not get surrounded by the water molecules in the same way. They kind of clump together and they try to hide themselves away from the polar water, and they do not dissolve nice and dispersed throughout the water. Okay, so water's polarity can affect the ability to dissolve different things. That's really important. You have lots of dissolved stuff in you: salt, oxygen, things like this, that's moving around in your bloodstream. Other things do not dissolve well in the liquid water in your body. And we'll come back to this principle a lot when we talk about membranes. But let's talk about the properties of water more generally. So we said water can form hydrogen bonds. And I said those hydrogen bonds were weak, except when we get millions or billions of them together. That's where some interesting things can happen. And that includes the properties of water when it becomes a solid. So as you're aware, right, ice floats. That's a little bit weird for a solid. Most solids are more dense than their liquids and do not float. But because of the hydrogen bond structure of water, when it freezes and becomes a solid structure, ice, it is actually less dense than liquid water. That's kind of cool. That leads to some interesting things. That also can be bad news for us. So, if you've ever heard of frostbite, that is literally when the water in your tissues freezes and those ice crystals build up and they will actually cause your cells to explode. This is bad news for you because those cells die and then you lose that tissue in the case when you have frostbite. Now, this is bad news for most organisms. There are some organisms that can survive cold, freezing temperatures. Particularly, there are fish and things like that. They basically have evolved an antifreeze substance that prevents ice crystals from building up in them and keeps their cells from exploding. You can also freeze bacteria and stuff like that if you replace liquid water with something else like glycerol or something like that. So we can store bacteria in a freezer for long periods of time, but we have not cracked how to store humans in a freezer for a long period of time, at least, and then revive them, right? We do store human parts in freezers, but we've never been able to revive someone out of that totally frozen state. So ice is bad news, but there are other interesting properties of water that are useful for us. Particularly these things called specific heat and heat of vaporization. Okay, again, you'll talk more about these in chemistry class, but let's briefly touch on them. So water has what's called a high specific heat capacity. And that means that it takes a long time for it to heat up and cool down. That is useful because warm-blooded animals use water to distribute heat throughout the body, right? So you can take heat from one area, it goes into the water, and it gets transferred to another area. The ocean then heats faster and colder. The ocean also heats slower and cools slower than on land, so the ocean can retain heat. That's why it's a great place for life. And if you live by the ocean, you have less frequent extremes of temperature. When I lived in Seattle, right, it rarely snowed, whereas here every winter it gets really freaking cold, right? Because we're farther from the ocean. We don't have that extra kind of buffer there to heat and cool at a slower rate. There's another part of this that is also very interesting. The heat of vaporization. Basically, that means that it requires a lot of energy to turn water into gas, water vapor, right? Why is that important for us? Well, many mammals, have evolved a cooling mechanism called sweating. Us in particular, we do this a lot. When you sweat, water comes out of your pores and forms a small layer on your skin. That is sucking heat energy out of your body and turning it into water vapor, gas. That takes a lot of energy. So you're using that evaporative process to cool yourself. Call that evaporative cooling. That's why when you're hot, you can spray yourself with water and you will feel cooler because it's actually sucking the heat energy out of your body to cool you down by evaporation. Now, if you don't have enough water, say you're dehydrated or something like that, you stop sweating and then you stop cooling. That is a bad scenario. Some other things that happen. Cohesion is a property where water creates surface tension. We talked about the water strider. It can walk on the top of water, right? Or you've probably seen water bead up with its surface tension. That's because water is cohesive. It sticks together. But also there's a property called adhesion, where water, its charge nature, can attract to other materials. Like in this case, we have capillary action, where the water is being kind of wicked up this tube by adhesion. Okay, why mention this? Well, adhesion and cohesion are really critical to many processes in life, including plants. Plants take in water through their roots from the soil, and that water has to move up to the leaves where photosynthesis is occurring. How does it do that? Well, we don't actually have all the answers. There's several hypotheses, but most of them involve this adhesion property and this capillary action. It gets drawn up through these tubes in the stem. We have the xylem, which is a special set of cells that are basically hollow tubes that suck the water upwards through these adhesion properties. Now, think about something like a redwood tree, 200 feet tall or something like that. The water has to transport a long way up there, and there's still a lot of questions about how they're able to pull that water up that high. But this is super important for crop plants and things like this to understand how they get water up to the photosynthetic organs. That's what we want to be making sugar and stuff like that to put into the fruit that we then harvest. So a lot of research goes into understanding this process. So water's properties, very, very important for life. Another important property of water is what we call the concentration of hydrogen ions in it. Okay, you may have heard of this as what we call pH. So in water, there's both hydrogen and hydroxide ions, as we call them, in there. And the amount of these ions that are in there lead to different pHs. pH technically stands for percent hydrogen, which is what the scale originally was. But we can think of it as how acidic or how basic is a substance. Pure water has 1 × 10⁻⁷ moles of hydrogen ions per liter of water. Okay, what is a mole? Come to that in just a second, but I want to introduce us to the scale. So pH 7, that 10⁻⁷, is distilled water. It's neutral, as we call it. If we go down the scale, we get more hydrogen ions, we get more acidic, and this is a logarithmic scale, so each jump is times 10. So this is 10 times more, this is 100 times more, this is 1,000 times more, so on and so forth, down the line. If we go the other way, less hydrogen ions, we have basic things like baking soda. Bleach is very, very basic. We also call basic substance alkaline. We call these acidic. Okay, so what does this mean for us? Well, let's talk about that thing, moles. This is an important chemistry unit that you may not have encountered. All right, we talked about atoms, right? Some atoms weigh more than other atoms. But if I have 5 gold atoms and 5 hydrogen atoms, they don't weigh the same. But I have the same amount of them, right? So 5 gold atoms are much heavier than 5 hydrogen atoms. That's really important because a lot of times we measure things by weight or mass. But a lot of times we want to know actually how many particles of something are present. That's where the unit mole comes in. A mole is a chemistry unit representing how many of something are present. 1 mole is equal to Avogadro's number, which is 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd particles. That means that we move the decimal place 23 times out here, keep adding zeros, and we will get 1 mole is that many particles of something. That's a little abstract and huge number to think of, but let's think of it this way. 1 mole of water, H2O, is 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd water molecules. Okay, let's look at what this means practically. Again, you'll do more of this in chemistry. I just want to introduce you to this concept. This is important. Moles, if we have 1 mole of water, which is H2O, and 1 mole of starch, which has lots of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens in it, it's much, much longer in terms of the number of atoms in it. 1 mole of each of these things does not weigh the same amount. If you were actually to weigh this out, 1 mole of water is equal to 18.02 grams. Okay. 1 mole of starch, the same number of particles, but each particle is bigger. 1 mole of starch weighs 359.3 grams. So much, much more because each molecule is bigger. This is why we can't always use weight, and sometimes in chemistry we have to use this term moles. All right. Side note done, back to pH. Okay, so this is a scale basically of how many hydrogen ions are in here. There's more moles of hydrogen ions in this bottom part than there are at the top part. That matters for our body because acids and bases can disrupt chemical bonds. Let's go with the one that you may have encountered. If you've ever spilled bleach or gotten bleach on your hands, you might think that it feels slippery. It's not actually the bleach that is slippery. It's the fats and oils in your skin that are being dissolved, that are coming out, that are becoming slippery. That's what the bleach is doing. It's disrupting chemical bonds in your cells. Same thing with strong acids, right? We have stomach acid, which is down near a pH of 1. You drop your food into your stomach, right? The stomach acid goes to work and starts breaking down the chemical bonds in your food. So we obviously want to make sure we maintain proper pH in the body. Stomach acid is great in the stomach. It's protected and encased there, but we don't want stomach acid in other parts of our body. So let's look at it something like this, okay? I'm going to present a scary scenario to you. Here we have a child, and they are drinking a jug of acid, okay? This jug of acid is known as orange juice. It has a pH of 3.9. Okay, that's very acidic. Why doesn't this child die from this highly acidic liquid? Well, we luckily in our body have a system called the buffer system. Buffers are substances that can absorb excess hydrogen or hydroxide ions. Okay, where do these hydroxide ions come from? Basically, the more basic you get, the more hydroxide ions you have, or the less hydrogen ions you have. That's the way to think of it. Basically, they're interchangeable ways of thinking about it. So more hydroxide ions, you're more basic. More hydrogen ions, you're more acidic. So what is a buffer doing? Well, a buffer is a substance that can absorb excess hydrogen or excess hydroxide, and it takes it in, and it keeps the system at a near constant pH. It can absorb only so much, though. At some point it will run out, but luckily we keep making buffers. So the buffer is absorbing excess hydrogen or excess hydroxide to keep the pH standard. So when you drink that jug of acid, right there, your orange juice, a buffer in your body absorbs the excess hydrogen ions and keeps your blood pH near 7.35 to 7.45, which is around neutral, right? So your blood is around neutral. You didn't want to disrupt it with this acid. So a buffer is absorbing that excess material there. Buffers are used all the time in chemistry, molecular biology, things like this. There are buffers that will keep pHs low. There are buffers that will keep pHs high. There are buffers that will keep pH neutral, like here in our body. It just depends on where we're looking. Okay, that is our primer on pH. Just to reiterate, pH is how much hydrogen ion is in there. The more of it, the lower on the scale we go. the more moles of hydrogen ions we have, because this is a negative number, right? So as we get lower on it, we get more. The more hydroxide ions we get, the less hydrogen ions we have, and that's the more basic we get. We want to make sure that we are at proper pH in our bodies so that the proper chemical reactions can occur, because acids and bases can disrupt chemical bonds. If we don't want that to happen, we need a buffer present to absorb the excess hydrogen and hydroxide that is in there. All right, so that's our chapter 2.2 on water. And like I said, water has a lot of these unique properties that other liquids don't have that make it so critical for life on Earth. Water's polar, which allows it to form the hydrogen bonds. That means it can dissolve many hydrophilic compounds. Those are usually polar or charged ions. Hydrophobic compounds, on the other hand, will not dissolve. Those are like our fats and oils, non-polar things. The specific heat capacity and heat of vaporization properties of water allow organisms to maintain homeostasis. So water helps us keep our body at a constant temperature. That's the main thing for humans. Hydrogen bonding also allows surface tension and adhesion. We talked about plants, the ability to suck water up from the roots to the leaves. That adhesive property is very important there. Then we talked about pH, which is a measure of how many hydrogen ions or how many hydroxide ions are dissolved in the water. More hydrogen, you get more acidic. More hydroxide, you are more basic. That's referred to acidity or alkalinity there. The pH can be disruptive of other chemical bonds. That's why it's important to our biology there. We talked about this term moles. A mole is a set number of things. Usually we're talking about a mole of molecules, and that is 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd of something. Again, that'll be very important in chemistry class. And then we talked about our buffers, which help absorb excess hydrogen or hydroxide ions to keep a stable pH there. All right, we will finish up this chapter in 2.3, where we're going to talk about another important substance, carbon.